violence affects women and girls of every race, class, culture, ethnicity, age, and country. Early marriage is a form of sexual and gender-based violence with detrimental physical, social, and economic effects. Zonta International strives to promote and protect the human rights of all women and girls and reduce the incidences of violence against them. Through funding from the Zonta International Foundation, the Zonta International Strategies to End Violence Against Women program has provided more than $9.5 million to support projects to prevent to end violence against women and girls in 46 countries so far. Yokohama Convention held last year made a brave decision to establish a major project, the biggest service project in terms of funding in Zonta's history, $2 million within this biennium to the Ending Child Marriage Project, a program to accelerate global action with UNICEF USA and UNFPA. Child marriage is a global violation of human rights that can be found in cultures, religions, ethnicities, and countries around the world. The Ending Child Marriage Project brings together governments, civil society, families, and young people in a collective effort to prevent girls from marrying too young and to support those already married. We have an honor to have with us today founder of Survivors Corner, Donna Pollard from Kentucky, US, with us. As a survivor of child marriage herself, Donna realizes the need for healing, support, and empowerment of past victims. Through her story, we can also very well understand that child marriage is not what is happening in the less developed countries, somewhere far away. No, it is happening here too. Finland passed an amendment in law thanks to Zonta International District 20's advocacy actions, among others. And as of 1st of June 2019, child marriage has not anymore been possible with exceptions, as it was until then. But let's face it, we do have girls within our society who are sent to their home countries to marry early, and that is not acceptable. Donna Pollard has successfully advocated for improved legislation in her home state in the US that put an end to child marriage through parental consent. But there is still a lot to do in this field of cruel human rights violence. Let us learn from Donna, who, by the way, just recently joined Zonta. Please, Donna, the stage is yours.
Welcome, and thank you for taking the time to hear me speak today about this critical global topic that has gone far too long overlooked. What I'm about to share with you is going to be uncomfortable. It will be uncomfortable for me to deliver the statistics demonstrating child marriage is a prominent problem, including in the United States, as well as to divulge to you why this topic is something that I'm so incredibly passionate about. It may be uncomfortable for you to hear, as the statistics themselves are overwhelming. But more than this, you will learn about the great disadvantages that children that are married before the age of adulthood are forced into. It is my belief, though, that this uncomfortability is necessary in order to bring about the change so desperately needed to prevent children from being forced and/or manipulated into situations leading to their exploitation. And that opportunity for change is worth this difficult but important conversation. Now, today I'm going to provide you with much information, but first I'm going to ask you to consider, what does exploitation mean to you? How would you define that? We are also going to go over some startling statistics from the United States, as well as discuss the implications of child marriage and the intersectionality with other forms of abuse, such as domestic violence and sexual assault. We will discuss the phases of grooming and how it is possible for an adult to interrupt the life of a child and have their parents agree to that exploitation. I will discuss with you my personal journey, and I would like to pause for just a moment and thank you very much for allowing me to stand here in my vulnerability and feel safe with you today. We will also discuss links between child marriage and human trafficking, and we will discuss finally where we go from here to advocate for policy and legislative changes on national and international levels. Now, there are a couple of words that I believe go hand in hand with the definition of human trafficking that to me are intricately linked to child marriage. And so before I take you into the statistics of underage marriage in just 4 U.S. states, I'd like to ask you to take a moment to consider how you would define a couple of words that I believe belong in this discussion. Our first word is exploitation. One of the definitions that most resonates with me, I've listed. Making use of a situation to gain unfair advantage for oneself. Here's our next word. Take just another moment to consider what comes to mind when you think of modern-day slavery. The definition that I have used is the often forced, excessive dependence on or devotion to someone or something. Now, too often, child marriage is seen as a problem that happens elsewhere, in developing countries, perhaps, as part of cultural norms. But as you can see by these statistics, the number of children married in my home country of the United States alone is astounding. In Maryland, 3,100 children were married between the years 2000 and 2014, with at least 69 of these cases resulting in matrimony between a victim of statutory rape under the age of 15 and a man at least 4 years their senior. 3,500 children were married in the state of New Jersey, including a 12-year-old girl and 25-year-old man. More than 3,800 children married in New York, including at least 3 cases of girls younger than the age of 15, marrying men at least 25 years of age. And finally, in Virginia, about 4,500 marriages occurred between 2004 and 2013, with an astounding 90% of these involving a female as the underage spouse, and several marrying an adult male. Collectively, that is nearly 15,000 children that were married before their 18th birthday in just 4 United States alone, before they were able to vote or get their driver's license without the signature of an adult, before they could consent to a tattoo or purchase a pack of cigarettes, in most cases, before they finished high school. These should not have been weddings. They should have been cases of statutory rape. The legality of child marriage, particularly in the cases of children under the age of 16, is perversely hypocritical, as many states regulate the age of individual consent, yet not parental consent of the marriage. By allowing minors to marry grown men, we are giving perpetrators an out and a green light to victimize those in an incredibly vulnerable position. Let us take a look at what underage marriage truly results in. As a married minor, the likelihood of completing a high school education is significantly decreased, which contributes not only to an educational disadvantage, but also to social isolation from one's peers, which is a critical need for healthy development. Minors are at a heightened risk of teenage pregnancy when married, with limited means of supporting themselves, as children typically are only able to find employment that pays the lowest of wages and is often part-time. And this, of course, leads to the need to depend on government assistance programs, which is very difficult to break the cycle from. Children married before 18 are in no way on equal footing with the adult spouse. They are entirely dependent upon them, without the ability to achieve housing on their own because of their age, much less have basic utilities such as electric or water or a phone set up in their name. This positions the minor in a place of subordination and servitude, preventing any means of escaping abusive and exploitive situations that are far too common. It is important to note that the implications of child marriage overlap with what has been clearly defined as child abuse and neglect by the Federal Child Abuse and Treatment Act. This is not exclusively at the hands of the adult spouse. The parents consenting to the underage marriage are promoting negligence of ensuring the safety and well-being of their child. During my advocacy work, I have spoken with many that have questioned whether or not changing legislation to remove the ability for a child to marry prior to the age of 18 was crossing the lines of individual rights of the parents. The definitions of abuse are clear. Giving consent for a child to marry a person they must now become entirely dependent upon until they reach adulthood should not be considered an individual parental right. It should be considered gross negligence and exploitation. Now, how is this even possible? How can this happen? Well, from a psychological standpoint, the phases of grooming include a perpetrator identifying vulnerabilities and exploiting those vulnerabilities with the victim, as you will soon hear about from my own personal journey. From there, the perpetrator may gain the victim's trust, including the trust of the victim's family. Oftentimes in child marriage cases, perpetrators look for families that are struggling economically, or perhaps they target those families where the parents have a chemical dependency or are prone to depression or other mental health conditions. The perpetrator then infiltrates the minor's life by fulfilling a need, perhaps with providing them food if that's something that is scarce in their life. And then from there, they begin isolating the child from their family and from their friends. I experienced that firsthand as well, as I was isolated from my sister and from other friends that would have spoken up and said that the situation was wrong. And then once the relationship has been sexualized, at that point, oftentimes the minor internalizes so much shame as their own, and they feel an obligation to continue satisfying and supporting the person that has exploited them, not realizing that this person is truly abusing them. And then finally, in grooming, a perpetrator will maintain control of a situation, such as through child marriage. Now, several states allow underage marriage to occur through loopholes, such as parental consent or judicial approval if certain criteria are met. These loopholes perpetuate predators from victimizing people that are vulnerable and then hiding their offenses behind a marriage license. And this is one of the reasons that policy change is so critical. Now, in the beginning, I told you that this discussion was going to be uncomfortable, and I was right. I share with you now the reason that I am so incredibly passionate about this mission to end child marriage. When I was born, my mother was at an advanced age, and she did not expect nor want me as a child. This was made very clear to me growing up through much physical, psychological, and emotional abuse. I was beaten with a belt for simple mistakes such as spilling a carton of milk or playing too loudly with my toys. I was ridiculed based on my appearance, and I was not allowed to participate in extracurricular activities. So I grew up very insecure and very isolated. And then when I was 12 years old, my father, who was a long-distance truck driver and rarely home, was diagnosed with advanced stage lung cancer, and he was given 6 months to live at this time. My mother left me alone to care for him. I would have to do things such as change his Depends or feed him mashed up foods. And it was a very horrific situation for a 12 and 13-year-old girl to be in, especially considering the fact that I was not well mentally or emotionally because of the abuse and isolation I had already endured. Well, my father ended up passing away 8 months after his diagnosis of lung cancer. I was 13 years old at the time. And I did not have an ability to cope with the abuse that I had suffered, nor his death, and I broke. I began acting out in self-destructive ways, and that ended up resulting in me being admitted into a behavioral health facility for treatment when I was 14 years old. Now, I wish I could tell you that the story ends here and that at that facility I received the help I needed and was able to move on with a healthy life, but unfortunately that is not what happened. In fact, in this behavioral health facility, when I was 14, instead of getting the help I desperately needed, my abuse was further perpetuated at the hands of an entrusted mental health technician that worked at the facility. He was 29 years old. Again, I was 14. He began connecting with me in small, simple ways at first, and what I now realize was flirtatious, grooming behaviors. And then he began progressing to writing me love letters and arranging to meet me in secure areas of the facility. Now, as a 14-year-old girl with hardly any self-esteem, I thought I was in love. And I thought that I was so special because this older man was giving me the attention that I had never felt I had had in my life. For the first time in my life, I felt that something was right with me. And that is how perpetrators are able to groom their victims. Once I was released from the facility, my mother allowed me to have a dating relationship with him. You know, keep in mind, she never actually wanted me as I was growing up. She saw me more as a burden. And so it was an opportunity, as she saw it, to offload her responsibility into the hands of another adult. And that is what she did. Just a couple of months after my 16th birthday, she consented to my marriage to this man who was 15 years older than I. Now, despite the challenges that I had in life, I had always been a successful student. My studies were one area where I felt like I had some type of control in my life. And so in the 8th grade, I had won a $10,000 Governor Scholarship Award for a writing achievement. And I was so proud of that, so looking forward to being able to go to college. Well, after my marriage, I ended up dropping out before completing the 10th grade because I could not enroll in the other high school when I went to live with my husband. I couldn't consent to my own enrolling. And you know that means that I lost that $10,000 Governor Scholarship Award and was completely devastated. I began working full-time as a cashier in a grocery store for minimum wage. My then husband had quit his job, and so I, at 16 years of age, was the only provider. He began exercising very manipulative behaviors as well, such as staging suicide attempts when a coworker had paid for my meal one evening. I felt a sense of obligation to him. I felt like anything that was wrong with him was my fault. When I was 17 years old, I became pregnant. I had my oldest daughter just after my 18th birthday. The breaking point for me where I realized how abusive the situation was and that I needed to get out was one morning when she was still a baby and she was on the floor crawling around, and her father had not been in a very good state mentally, and he had me down on the ground choking me, and she looked up and laughed. And of course, she's a baby. She has no clue that this is wrong. In her mind, her mommy and daddy are playing. And it was in that moment that I realized that if I did not get out of the situation, she was going to grow up normalizing this behavior. And that cycle would perpetuate for her. Now again, I wish I could tell you that that's all it took and I was able to escape from the situation and take her with me and rebuild our lives together. But that did not happen either. You see, I was 18 years old. I had no education. I had been working for minimum wage. And so when I was finally able to get away from him and get a divorce, custody was granted to my perpetrator. So my daughter, who will be 18 herself in just a few months, has been the ultimate victim in this entire situation because she has had to grow up the majority of her life feeling as though her mother completely abandoned her. And still to this day, though I have been isolated from her through parental alienation by my perpetrator, I continue to pay him, my rapist, child support because the custody was awarded to him. And please do not misunderstand, I absolutely believe that I should support my daughter, and however I am able to, I always will. But I should be able to be there for her more than financially. I should be able to be a part of her life, there for all of the milestones that she achieves in her own development. I should be able to provide her with the demonstrated unconditional love that I have been able to provide my 12-year-old daughter, who is from a different, non-abusive relationship. And so, within all of these atrocities that have happened in my life, I decided I would not be a victim and live in shame any longer, because another person's crime against me and the legality of this crime in no way is my shame to bear. And that is what has led to the change in law in multiple states in the United States that address child marriage. Now, I'd like to take a moment to reflect on what you have learned over the past few moments, as well as my own experience that I just shared, and I think you'll agree. The realities of human trafficking and child marriage are interchangeable in many ways. Despite the horrific events of my own experience, I was one of the lucky ones. There have been perpetrators that have used the marriage card in an effort at exploiting their brides in even more horrific ways than what I and my child have endured. And perhaps the most devastating part of this is that the opportunity for exploitation is acquired legally because of the current legislation that allows for this injustice. Now, how can we stop child marriage from occurring? Legislation must be implemented to remove the ability for parents to consent to their child marrying. And I know we want to believe that parents only have the best in mind and in heart for their children, but unfortunately, that's not always the case. And that is evidenced by the high rates of child protective services cases, in particular in the United States. We must have stricter legislation that does not allow for the age of consent to be different than for underage marriage. In many states, including my home state of Kentucky, the age of consent is 16 years of age. But there was no minimum floor for the age of marriage prior to us changing the law. We must continue to advocate for more resources for children that are currently trapped in underage marriages as well. As you've learned, in my situation, I had no access to be able to even enroll in school because I had not yet reached the age of adulthood. I tried to escape also by going to a domestic violence shelter and was turned away because I was not yet an adult. And despite the fact that I was working full-time, I could not get an apartment of my own because I could not legally enter into a contract. If child marriage continues to be legal, we must be providing adequate resources to children to prevent them from being trapped in that cycle of abuse. Now, in the state of Kentucky, prior to us being able to change the laws, there were a significant number of cases. So prior to the legislative change, children ages 16 and over were able to marry with parental consent alone, no questions asked, even if it was evident to the county clerk that the minor was in an abusive and exploitive situation. They had no authority to intervene. Children under the age of 16 were able to marry through judicial approval if there was a pregnancy involved. And I know we hear that and we would like to think that there's no way that a judge would consent to the marriage of a child if it was an abusive situation. But as you can see, of the nearly 10,000 cases that have occurred since the year 2000 in the state of Kentucky, one of those was between a 13-year-old girl and 33-year-old man. That pregnancy was evidence of rape. And by allowing this marriage to occur, not only does this perpetrator now have access to continue victimizing this child, but they also have access to her own child. Nearly 2,000 of those cases occurred since the year 2010, a very recent period of time. And 208 of the underage marriages that occurred since 2010 indicated a male as the underage spouse. The overwhelming majority of 1,782 included the female as the underage spouse, evidencing this as a problem with the status of women and how we are currently held. Some additional examples that we fought against for ages 16 and 17 included over 400 cases in which the spouse was 21 years of age or older. There was a 16-year-old girl that was wed to a 32-year-old man. Another 16-year-old girl wed to a 44-year-old man. There was a 17-year-old girl that was wed to a 72-year-old man. Of the children that were ages 15 and under, again, where a pregnancy was involved and a judge signed off on the marriage, there were many cases in which the spouse was at least 5 years older than the child, meaning that they had all of the rights of a legal adult, whereas she did not. There was a 14-year-old girl wed to a 21-year-old man, and a 15-year-old girl that was wed to a 30-year-old man, as well as a 14-year-old boy that was wed to a 20-year-old woman. Now, because of my experience and choosing to no longer remain in silence or in shame, and deciding to step in to embracing my bravery and connecting with other survivors and organizations that would be able to help me propel a legislative change forward. Senate Bill 48 was passed in the state of Kentucky in 2018 that put an end to child marriage through parental consent. Now, although an age 18 bright line would have definitely been our preference, we realized very early on that that was not going to be achievable in my home state of Kentucky. And what I had to realize through this process of advocating was that you cannot let good be the enemy of perfect. I cannot sit back and allow for 13-year-olds to be married off to 33-year-olds when they're pregnant. And so we did the next best thing within the bill language. And we wrote it in such a way that 17-year-olds would be able to still marry with judicial approval alone, but pregnancy is not the only item that should be looked at. Pregnancy should not even be considered if a judge is considering authorizing a marriage. We had the criteria built so that the minor would have to evidence that they had either obtained their GED or their high school diploma already. They would have to evidence that they could be self-sufficient, such as living independently for 3 months and working for the past 3 months. We also created a cap of 4 years in age disparity between the minor and the person that they would be marrying in order to take away the opportunity for perpetrators to hide their offenses behind a marriage license. It takes all of us working together to be able to end child marriage, as it is still currently legal in the majority of the United States, as well as countries around the world. I ask you to join us in the fight to ensure that these predators are no longer able to hide their offenses and prevent criminal charges from being pressed against them by obtaining a marriage license and committing repeat victimization. Thank you for your time today and for your dedication and your continued advocacy.
Thank you, Donna, for interesting and personal keynote. Thank you so much. This year's Zonta Says No campaign, which is kicking off on 25th of November, will concentrate on ending child marriage. So there we have yet another possibility to advocate and make this human rights violation issue visible. So let's take use of that possibility.